Hey everyone, this is the last episode of Coordinated Universal Time. It was a successful experiment, but we're calling it now. You know, better to burn out than to fade away. We had a series of hypotheses when we started. Could we make something beautiful, connecting, collaborative? Could we push the medium of podcasts a bit? I'm happy to report that yes we can. And you can too. In the best case scenario, maybe this podcast inspired others to carry that flame forward with their own projects. If one of those people were you, let us know. We'd love to hear about it. Even though our journey together on UTC was only 8 months and 5 episodes, along the way we connected people across several continents. We wrote a lot of new music. We're inspired by the likes of Mark Fisher, Italo Calvino, Angel Mark Lloyd, Terrence McKenna, Derek Jensen, J.G. Ballard, and many others. And for our last episode, I couldn't imagine a better guest. Gabriele de Seta is a media anthropologist practicing in Taiwan and Italy. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy.
Okay, cool. So I guess with that, we can just dive right in. Do you want to just give a quick intro for those of us or our listeners who aren't as familiar with your work?
Yeah, sure. Well, my name is Gabriele de Seta, and but you can call me Gabriel. I have multiple international versions of my name in every place I go. But yeah, I am. Well, I guess I have an academic background, and I'm still pretty much in academia doing research. And I have a quite mixed academic background. So the shortest way of presenting my work is saying I'm a media anthropologist, but I don't actually have a degree in anthropology. And so I jumped between different departments and universities and disciplines. And I'm kind of a mixed, background person that has done some Asian studies, some cultural studies, some sociology. And then I ended up working in my most recent position was in Taiwan, where I was a postdoctoral fellow in an Institute of Ethnology, which is how they call anthropology there. And most of my work has been related to China and digital media and different configurations of this topic. So I've written about vernacular creativity, memes, selfies, different forms of sociality, social media, civility and incivility. It depends. And on the side, I also written quite a bit about music and sound and listening, um, also based on kind of ethnographic research about uh, underground experimental music in Asia, especially in China and Hong Kong and in Taiwan. And yeah, recently just been exploring a little bit more about theoretical aspects of situated listening and music making and sound making.
Awesome. I do want to explore kind of the parallels between the sound work and the kind of the more academic ethnography work, because I think there's
Sure.
interesting kind of parallelism there. But I think maybe a good starting off point would be, as we were talking about, the fact that this is a podcast, we're recording it. I have a field
Mhm.
mic actually that I'm using. you had a essay not too long ago that you titled "Against Sonic Naturalism,"
Yeah.
and I thought that might be an interesting jumping off point.
Yeah. Well, that essay was quite controversial, and um, well, so basically, what happened was that I've been doing field recordings for since maybe 10 years ago when I started doing more experimental music, noise type of stuff. A part of it was just going around with tape recorder or a dictaphone and just recording random stuff. And then I realized that there was a genre of music that was called field recordings, and people can just release CDs and tapes filled with stuff you record around the world, and that's like music, or it's sound. It's something that people listen to. So more recently, after doing some ethnographic work on different music scenes and experimental musicians, then I started thinking about, okay, some of these musicians do field recordings. Let's look into field recording as a genre, as a music genre, and as a form of practice. And what does it mean to do field recordings? And is there any discussion happening there? And so just I read more and more books and articles and reviews, and then I started listening to more records that I didn't listen to before, like the big classics, and looking at some exhibitions. And I guess I've been thinking about this thing for years, and I gave a talk maybe 2 years ago in Toronto at this conference. It's called Tuning Speculation, which is all about sound. And so I just gave a very coarse, undeveloped version of this argument at that conference, and people were like, "Oh yeah, that's interesting. It's nice. You should develop it," and blah blah blah. And so at some point, I was in Taiwan, and I went to see this exhibition by an artist who's a French artist who lives in Taiwan. He's a pretty big name in field recording, and he curated his exhibition with some classic works and some local works. And I spent maybe 3 hours one day and a couple of hours another day just going through all these works and taking them in and trying to use the experience of the exhibition to rethink through my arguments. And then the essay you mentioned kind of came out of that. So it was kind of it was not really an exhibition review. It was more like, okay, let's look at this exhibition and
Sure.
think about these problems more broadly. And the main argument was that 95% of all field recordings that I listened to and that I looked at and read about were deeply committed to this naturalist aesthetic and also ontology
Yeah.
and epistemology. So it's like the very idea of taking a microphone and recording things for many people is taken as an act that has some naturalist connotations, not in the sense of it's not like it's not an ecological argument. It's not a it's not a connection to nature as nature versus culture. It's more like the idea of a naturalistic representation. And so I personally don't like it. And what I wanted to do was understanding why I don't like it, why I have this, very much bodily response to it of just like, no, this is not good, right? I just wanted to understand. So I wrote that essay as a kind of inquiry into this problem. Yeah, I mean, what I realize is that visual media have gone through a lot of reflection in this respect. So from landscape painting through photography, there have been a lot of discussions about, okay, when you take a photo of something, it doesn't mean that it represents that thing, right? It's not the same thing, and there is a lot involved in representation and the materiality of the camera and of the printing and of the media through which you look at the photo and the sensors and everything. And so today, very few people think about image making in this strictly naturalist framework. But for some weird reason, when it comes to sound, especially field recordings, this is still very much a mystique. And yeah, that was kind of the problem that I was trying to identify in phonography and field recording.
It does strike me as being kind of similar to this sort of ethnographic approach to knowledge and to experience, and that there's not this privileged, like pure, unfiltered form of knowledge in ethnography's case, or like music or sound in this case, that like not only is everything mediated, but there's also nothing like unfiltered on the other side of the lens or the microphone either. That there's not really like you get tied in knots when you start to talk about this.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's all
without
right.
the
That's normal. I think it's
um,
good.
yeah.
I mean, it's not just a problem of okay, it's mediated, so we need to account for that. And I think that's, I mean, of course, that's an important step to say, okay, I'm using a microphone to record a thing. Uh, so I need to look at what the microphone does and how it does it. And, a microphone just basically takes vibrations in and makes them into something that a human ear can understand. So you're creating sound when you do field recording. But besides that, I think there is the whole issue of representation, even if you account for materiality of technology and blah, blah, then some people do it and I really appreciate it, but then what remains is this idea that still you're doing field recording and you're doing I don't know, you're doing a recording of like 2 hours of this specific place, because then what comes out of it is a piece of sound that you put on a record or online, and that piece of sound is a representation of this place or this event. There is still a very much naturalistic framework that underpins this idea. Um, Whereas if you thought about the same thing for, I don't know, photography, right? It'd be like, okay, I took a 2 hour video of this mountain and then I put it here, and that's the mountain. The people be like, yeah, so like what's the point? First of all, it's just one perspective on the mountain on one day of
Yeah.
the year, and then what's yeah, I mean, it might be beautiful to look at, but um, what does it mean, and why did you do it, and why is like 100 people doing the same thing, and
Hmm.
whether there's people listening to it. So I thought, of course, if there's an audience and there is a group of musicians who produce works, and some of these works I actually enjoy, but I was very curious about why sound carries this mystique of immediacy much better than visual media. It's very common, like even besides field recordings, when you go to sound art exhibitions, many sound art works are very much grounded on this idea that sound is somehow immediate, intimate. Uh, so they ask the audience to just feel the sound and just be connected in a direct way to this or that.
Well, you have a line in the essay where you talk about how it's because of the experience of sound has like a different affective like flavor.
Yeah, you mean like it's more embodied, and there is a very, very rich body of writing and theory about you know, that you don't just listen with your ears, but with all your body, and it's this vibrational forces and uh, things. I think that helps people feel, and artists feel that if you pass through sound, you somehow have a more direct access to experience or to perception. But what I was saying about Jonathan Stern, he wrote about this idea of a audiovisual litany, and by this he means this idea that has been shared by many writers over time, that uh, listening and seeing, or hearing and watching, I mean, all these two domains of experience are kind of uh, in parallel, and they have some neat divisions. So for example, vision is more um, some are more direct and some are more indirect, some are mediated, some are less direct, mediated. And so like many artists and writers uh, actually unthinkingly or unwillingly even uh, use this kind of dualism between these two senses to perpetuate this idea that sound is more embodied and more direct and more relational and more intimate and blah blah, whereas vision is distancing and too rational and blah blah. Yeah.
So, what are the consequences, or some of the consequences of this kind of confusion or mystification of sound? Like why is this bad?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's bad as in, it shouldn't be done. And I still, sometimes I just enjoy taking a, field recording of a jungle somewhere and just listen to it and chill out. But the I think it's the same problem that was criticized in anthropological writing in the 80s and 90s. And here, so we can link back to that ethnographic theory, body of ethnographic theory. And it's the problem of the politics of writing, the politics of representation. And so both in there and, as I said, in visual media, there have been critiques of what it means to represent something. So you observe it, you record it, you document it, and then after you've done that, you go home or you go in a different context and you represent those things you have accumulated, this data. And the problem with field recordings or phonography at large is the same: is that if you abide to this naturalist framework, you just don't do all this self-critical reflection on what you're doing, and you just think that you have a microphone, you have an external reality, and you can just capture a part of it, and then you can put it somewhere, maybe in a lossless file, and this idea of high quality and high fidelity, and you're just reproducing something, and that's it's in itself worth of the other people's time to go listen to it. I think it's not bad as much as it is a waste of the medium and on the possibilities that actually sound recording and sound reproduction can offer thought and communication and representation.
So that idea of possibilities is something I want to latch onto. I don't know if you got a chance to look at the Mark Fisher article I sent over earlier.
Sure.
So something that he talks about that I think is maybe valuable to tie in here. He talks about certain types of music. Dub or hauntology is something he kind of coins to talk about it. How it foregrounds the produced character of music. How instead of trying to obfuscate or hide the fact that something is being recorded, you put that front and center by having the hiss and the crackle of the recording equipment. And he contrasts this with a term I also wasn't familiar with, rockism, which is kind of this focus on live performance and kind of this fetishizing of this pure experience of music. If hauntology or dub foregrounds the produced character of music, then maybe ethnography foregrounds the produced character of research.
I think it's very much true, although ideally it should be like that. I don't think doing ethnographic research is just just a method, and you can do it very you can do very good ethnography, or you can just use it as a little piece of your research, and it's perfectly fine. But
Sure.
I don't think that what you're mentioning as this idea of being self-reflexive about representation is it's kind of a basic tenet of ethnographic research, and a lot of people recommend it, and not everyone always abides to it, because sometimes it's not relevant to the actual project you're doing. But it's an ideal you should strive towards, and I think it's very much the same thing. And I remember the article by Fisher had a very interesting sentence. I'm trying to find. It was the beginning of. I remember I read it back then when all the ontology movement was kind of bursting out. This is on page 49. There is this sentence that I thought was quite pivotal for our discussion today. It says, "We are suddenly made aware again of what the first listeners to phonograph recordings were acutely conscious. They were witnessing a captured slice of the past erupting into the present." So this is he's very much connecting the debate about ontology emerging from, in this case, I guess, UK music in the early 2010s, to this broader discussion about the arrival of recording sound as a possibility. Which, I mean, he's quoting Kittler here, but it's this idea that the phonography, like the invention of the phonograph, was a kind of a breakthrough in the history of media, because for the first time people were aware that sound was not just always present, presentness, but there was this possibility that sound could come from the past, or that sound, as in this case, would say something about the future.
And then in Fisher's argument, he ties this to Afrofuturism.
Yeah, exactly.
And the idea that This is something that's new for the UK and the US and Europe in the 21st century, but it's something that the African diaspora has been dealing with for centuries.
Yeah.
And this kind of encounter between a lost past and a canceled future.
Yeah, I think more broadly is this. I don't remember where I was reading about this, but like these days I was reading something else that was entirely related, but I think it was something from Nagaristani. But it was this whole.
Mhm.
It's a matter of like a larger matter of temporality. So what he's saying here is that in in Western time, ontology was like drawing on, was just evidencing this little breaches through which time, in this case the past, was erupting into Western temporality. And Afrofuturism was doing exactly the same, but like suddenly showing that there was a possibility of the future, like barging into the present.
So, is there any tie here that we could make? Would it be artificial to draw this tie again with ethnography and foregrounding the practice of research and how this kind of captures something from the past and packages it? Is there anything similar happening there, or is that too much of a stretch? What do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think it's always there is a very good book by Johannes Fabian, who's I think he's a German anthropologist, but it's called Time and the Other, and it's just a big theoretical anthropological reflection on the role that time plays in um, yeah, basically anthropological research and encountering the other. And so basically the premise of most let's say Western epistemology is that one encounters the other always in one's own time. So much of anthropology was premised on this idea that I go somewhere and I encounter the other living, in some kind of different temporality than the West, than Europe, and then I bring back their experience and I write it up in the framework of European present, and they will always forever live in a different temporality. They will be always like, in the past, in a colonial past, or in a past of primitives. The idea of like primitive, it just means they're living in a different temporality. And so he says that this creates a denial of coevalness. So you deny the possibility of living in the present to different groups of people that do not belong to your epistemic community. So in this case, it will be Western academia and theory and universities and anthropology. But at large, I think at large this is still true in many aspects of the contemporary world. So there are many cases in which different communities write about other groups of people and assign them different temporalities as a way to keep them at bay or to
Right.
colonize their time, or the other way around, to take something back. What Fisher and most Afrofuturists or people writing about this kind of disruptive temporalities in speculative thought and fiction, they have been mostly writing about specific examples of this broader idea that time is not just a singular thing, but there are many possibility of actually exploiting it.
So we've been talking about ethnography a lot as a method and a practice and as something that you use in your research and as something that also exists in the world as a thing people do. So I guess my question coming from that is, what does ethnography allow you to do that other methods don't? What does it give you? And then what are its limitations? What can it not do? What is it dangerous to try to do with ethnography?
Well, I think for me, the main reason to start doing work that is partly ethnographic or is informed by ethnographic research is that most of my research revolves around media and mediation as an activity. And of course, the first approach to this kind of topic is to do different kinds of analysis of media. So you look at movies and memes or whatever, like sounds or songs and stuff. And so it's like what media studies does at large. But something you miss, especially so if you do this at home, like if I'm from Italy, And if I start doing a research project about how Italian people do take selfies or something, um, I am able to probably do a pretty good job without ever even talking to anyone because I live here and I had a life experience here. I see people around me. I can overhear them talk, and I have a pretty good idea about how to take selfies. So, what happens when you go in a context that is entirely different or like mostly not alien, but very much estranged from your experience? So, in my case, I was doing research in China and then Hong Kong and then Taiwan. So, what happens is that you have two paths, and you can decide to either just continue to do analysis of different kinds of media and hope that you get it right, you get a sense of how they're actually produced and circulated, or you have to talk to people. And to me, ethnography is entirely this. It's just like the idea of being somewhere doing research and talking to people about what you're doing and trying to understand with them the topic of your interest, and then listening to what they have to say, and giving them the chance to shape your research project, to influence it and to
Mm,
change your mind.
yes.
So it's not, I've never approached it, maybe because I didn't have a training in anthropology, so it's not like I'm 100% committed, or I think it's the only way of doing relevant research. But I always approached it as a way, as a tool or a toolbox through which you can open up issues that you
Yeah,
might otherwise not really have access to. Also, I do mostly qualitative research because of my training, so
sure.
it's pretty natural to put an ethnographic component in it. But I have colleagues who do massive quantitative work, but they also still use ethnography to get an entry point into the data, or to check that what they're seeing is actually grounded in reality. So I think it's a very flexible toolbox, and a lot of people are adapting it, from art to market research. So it's not just in academia.
I'm part of an interesting Slack group about applied ethnography and taking ethnography and applying it to user experience research and other fields. It's actually, I don't know if you're, it's Trisha Wang is the one who started it.
Oh yeah, I think
So
you
she
told
has a
me
lot of
about this.
interesting work
Yeah.
on, yeah, yeah. Um, and that was actually, my entry point into looking at China and digital media in China was kind of through her work,
Yeah.
and so from the beginning, my experience of it has been flavored by this kind of ethnographic orientation towards what can be known about the internet in China, which is that all of the big data studies, you might be able to make some interesting charts and graphs, but like the actual knowledge has to come from talking to people and allowing them to change your mind, like you said. We also mentioned last time briefly about kind of the classic ethnographic problem of like outsideness versus immersion, and I think maybe all of this leads to another question for you, which would be, what do you think that ethnography has been able to allow you to learn or experience as an Italian or as a Westerner in China that you wouldn't know otherwise? Like what has surprised you or changed your mind?
I mean, to go back to the previous point, I think this the balance between outsideness and, how did you put it,
Immersion.
immersion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very productive on the one hand, because okay, you're in a new place, or in a place that you're not unfamiliar with, and you feel like you're thrown out into the outside, and trying to achieve some kind of immersion, you can make yourself at home and start understanding the place in its own rights, is great. And I also think that this makes it somewhat easier to present some findings and to represent what you're seeing or what you experience, because I'm imagining, if you're, for example, if you're American, and you say, okay, I'm going to do an ethnography of digital media use in the Rust Belt, right? Or like in rural, I don't know, like a rural state. Um, then, first of all, it would be probably more difficult to achieve immersion in a context that you might be, either partly unfamiliar with, or that you might have a lot of preconceptions about, or or maybe you've moved out of it and then you come back and you have to adjust again. And on the other hand, you also have politics, because when I went to China when I was maybe 20, 21, and I had no idea about the country, and I had no idea about the role that a country had in geopolitics or geopolitical debates or international relations. I was just there, and I started to try to figure out my life there. But if you imagine yourself doing the study in rural America, you probably would go there with pre-existing politics about what your conclusions might say about the country or the world at large. So it might be even more complicated to represent or be at ease with yourself and with what you're saying, what you find out among the people. So for me, it was not even a conscious choice. When I went to China for the first time, it was to study language, and then I went back several times to maybe get a degree and get my language a little bit better. So my approach was unknowingly ethnographic, in the sense that I was often alone, or I had to make new friends, or I had to figure out ways of talking to people to get what I needed. And quite naturally, at least for me, it came quite naturally to say, okay, let's talk to this person or this other person and see what they think and how they explain what is happening in this place or in the country, or what's the idea about it. And so even before I could formalize it as, okay, I'm doing ethnography, I'm an anthropologist, I'm studying this or that, it was just a way of making sense of my surroundings. And I think a lot of people do it, um, even non-professionally, as a way of existing. So that's also why I think it's such a powerful research method.
Yeah, now that you talk about that, I think something that maybe subconsciously drew me to ethnography as well was, being in China, and I was learning about China formally in school, learning about the politics and the history at
Right.
the same time as I was learning about it informally from, Chinese friends and teachers.
Yeah, exactly.
And the stories I was hearing from these two different sources were very, very different.
Yeah.
And uh, I think something that ethnography does is allow you to kind of thread between those two things and figure out how the media narratives of China are different from, and somehow still also arise from, the reality on the ground.
Yeah, I think one thing that is often criticized in anthropological writing and theory in general is that the conclusion of 90% of all papers and books is always it's complicated. Like, it's more complicated than when we began, and now that's the conclusion. It's complicated, we need to look more into it, or some variations of this.
Yeah.
It's always like that. And even in my art, I realize that even in my writing, I just I start with this deeply immersive vignette, and then I move into theory and I discuss some methods and analyze some stuff, and then the conclusion, and just say, okay, well, it's more complicated than I thought. I need to write more, and then to look into more details. And so this is the usual conclusion of ethnographic work, and I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's wrong. I think it's precisely what you're mentioning, it that you go to China and you do or to any place, yeah, and you go study the language, and you're exposed to what the university or the language school wants to tell you about the country, which is something they packaged for foreigners. And then you talk to some friends who are students, and they're local students, and they give you a different version of what they see around them. And then you talk to entrepreneurs, or you do some market research, and you're exposed to different worldviews, and it necessarily becomes more complicated. And I don't think the point is doing a massive synthesis at some point. I think the job is to follow these complications.
We started on this when we were talking about hauntology and how Fisher ties this to Afrofuturism.
Yeah.
And then speaking of China and all the hype surrounding it, even the weird corners of Twitter are not immune to the China hype, because Sinofuturism is also, I think, no less guilty of the same kind of
Yeah.
just glorification or fetishization of China as some kind of herald of the future. And I think last time we talked to you, your conclusion basically with regard to Sinofuturism is there's not really anything there, that it's mostly the same kind of media narratives of that the business world or the geopolitical world is also guilty of. At least, when I think about Hong Kong or Shanghai, Anna Greenspan has the book Shanghai Future about how, Shanghai has looked to the past for its vision of modernity and moving towards this kind of imagined, like reconstructed 1920s, where it's once again the Pearl of the Orient. I think Taiwan, I don't know as much about, but it maybe also has a symptom of this, where, as kind of the anti-China, it's a vision of a China that is, plugged into global capitalism and is democratic. And maybe coming from all this, like, what do you think that China or Shanghai or Hong Kong or Taiwan can tell us about the future, or can they tell us anything? Is this just a wild goose chase?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'm working on different, yeah, I'm basically, always reworking my previous arguments. So
Mm-hmm.
recently I've been, working on this stuff I've been writing about Sinofuturism at different points. But I wouldn't say that it's just nothing. I think it's quite interesting because if you look back at how Sinofuturism emerged, it's very much connected to what we were discussing about Afrofuturism and
Mm-hmm.
temporalities and the UK in the 90s and stuff like that. Because there are clear genealogies. So we know how the term emerged, and it was very much shaped by music, by certain underground communities of musicians, and kind of it was interesting because at that time it was a time when China was not really in the global conversation. It was maybe once in a while on a magazine cover saying, "Oh, this is the next big thing." It's getting on the radar of world markets and stuff like that. But it was not
Right.
as today. And so that was a time when looking at China was really it was very much similar, and I can see how it became kind of just a version of Afrofuturism. So saying, okay, we have Afrofuturism where we sketched the contours of this complex temporality, and then what about China? What kind of temporality would that be? China coming back from the future, or the famous Neo China arrives from the future and all that stuff. And you can kind of draw a line from that kind of Sinofuturism to today's Sinofuturism, which I think is pretty much a combination of different things. There is, state propaganda, because China loves to say, okay, we have our economy planned, and here's our development plans for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And in a way, many, Western media love to say, oh, China's going to do this in 10 years, and they're going to build, solar power in all the country, and they're going to send people to Mars and stuff. And then you have academia and research, and then you have businesses who look at China as a market, and so try to push it as a future market and for investment. And there are multiple threads that come together in this, what then people perceive as the idea that China is the future. Because to many people, it just trickles down to this fact. And so if you ask, people on the street, it's like, what do you think about China? It's like, yeah, it's the future, developing fast.
Sure.
There's money, and
Yeah.
they're gonna be better than the U.S. So it's it's morphed from this very speculative exercise in imagining a distant foreign place in futurist terms to something very much different. And to tie it back to Fabian's idea of like a denial of coevalness, what I've been thinking about and what I've been writing about is, old school Orientalism was, mostly about the Middle East and the Near East, but it was basically European people going there and saying, the Middle East is stuck in the past. It's a place of wonder and eternal pastness.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he called this a denial of coevalness, because you would say, okay, Middle Easterners and Semitic people and Arabs, they're stuck in the past. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this way, you can distance them and kind of rule them. And I'm wondering if, with Sinofuturism and other kinds of futurism, if this isn't just the same thing, but of a reversed polarity. So you're saying, Chinese people live in the future, which on the surface, it seems like oh, it's great. You mean they're more advanced or more, you're already doing stuff that we should be doing. But on the other hand, you're just, taking 1.6 billion people and saying, you live in a different temporality.
Hmm.
Like you already live in the future. So like don't come to Europe, or don't mess with my trade, or don't steal my factories and stuff like that. So there is still this idea of like keeping uh, communities or nations at bay through the
Hmm.
deployment of separate temporalities, and
Hmm.
that's what I find interesting. So I think rather than saying, oh, there's nothing there, it's more productive to, and what I'm trying to do is to say, okay, let's look at what threads are there, and how this idea of China as the future is being shaped up by different people, and how it's influencing geopolitics and economy.
I mean, it's interesting also because, during that span of time when China was not really part of the global conversation, as you put it, um, China was also probably the world's one great exception to kind of the post Cold War consensus as far as politics and economics. And there was this kind of expectation that China would join the fold, after it joined the WTO and all of these things, the Olympics.
Yeah.
Um, and that has proven to be not so much the case. And I'm not sure if that's a fulfillment of the kind of Sinofuturistic, the original Sinofuturistic um, vibe that maybe what China is doing is like demonstrating that yes, it is carving out a future that's different from um, the one that we had thought that it would, the path that we thought it would take. But at the same time, maybe it's it makes me think of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong being for the longest time the exception to the exception, the part of China that was kind of plugged into um, to global capital and commerce, and now this recent kind of eruption of tensions between China and Hong Kong is they're really just it's like different visions of the future, different visions not just of China's future, but also you know everything is so much more global now that like everything has connotations not just for China, not just for Hong Kong, but like for where the world is going. Everyone like it's hard not to read into these conflicts some kind of um, vision of future uh, conflicts in Europe or the U.S. Um,
Well, I mean, what I can say is that I do agree that it is interesting to see, if China is actually carving a different future for itself. But this is what most narratives about, most Sino-futurist narratives or point of views kind of miss, because I'm always reading them, and they end up just interpreting things that happen, but not really looking at how China itself as an actor, as a, I don't know, Chinese government or some specific authorities or Chinese entrepreneurs or even the Chinese public, how do they articulate their own futures? Because one thing, I mean, at least one thing that struck me, uh, the many times I was on fieldwork in China at different points in time and in different cities, is that okay? I was reading all this Sino-futurist stuff, and then if I look around me, of course, I see massive buildings and screens everywhere and whatever. But then when I talk to people, people very rarely say, "Oh yeah, I'm really looking forward to my Sino-future." Right? The people are concerned about their future, and they're like
right,
uncertain, and the futures they imagine or that they're working towards are very rarely related to their country or
right.
to their feeling of nationhood, right? They might actually want to leave, or they might just want to make money, as quick
Mm-hmm.
as they can, where they
Mm-hmm.
can, and live in the place that's more comfortable. So, I mean, I'm not saying that, that they're all the same, but to me, these ideas of futurity are much more interesting than the, massive narratives that are often kind of like hyped on the media.
Yeah, I think I was guilty of that just now. It's hard not to fall into this trap of trying to see uh, some kind of grand narrative like emerging from the small local stories. Not like it's hard when you're thinking about specifics not to try to connect them back to some grand vision of possible futures or
Yeah, sure, but I don't think it's wrong. I think it helps. I mean, you need to do it to kind of like get your bearings and figure out where you are and where people are. But yeah, I feel that it's more interesting to look into that, the actual articulations of the future. Um,
Yeah.
and another thing is also, yeah, I mean, yeah, you mentioned Hong Kong. I think that's a great case study at the moment because um, Hong Kong is the archetypal capitalist capital
Right.
city state almost. I mean, special administrative region that China uses to interface with global capitalism. And they're clearly right now, there are clearly, and there have been for a decade maybe, uh, articulations of a futurity that is not the official one that comes from China, because the one from China is clearly stated. It's it has a deadline on 2047, after which nobody knows what will happen. But there
Hmm.
are continuous efforts to integrate Hong Kong with Shenzhen and in the greater Pearl River Delta. So there are clear plans for the future of Hong Kong on the Chinese side. And what you see in Hong Kong is the emergence of alternative ideas of what Hong Kong should be. So it should be, um, for the most radical, independence, like achieving independence. For others, it should be resisting certain specific attempts by China at speeding up the process of integration. Um, and so I think this is like a case study in one specific Sinofuturism that maybe it's Hong Kong futurism, or anyway, it doesn't matter. The name doesn't matter, but it's clear that there is not just one China. And I'm not talking about national sovereignty, but I'm talking about the
Sure.
idea, people's idea of being Chinese or being from Hong Kong. And I'm thinking in Taiwan, nobody wants to hear about Sinofuturism because it doesn't concern them. Because I don't know the percentage, but I'm guessing a substantial part of Taiwan wouldn't have much to do with China, but some others might. And I talk to people who think they're Chinese and are very much happy to do business with China, and they think Taiwan is part of China. And so, for them, the future of a strong China and a wealthy China and engaged in business with Taiwan is great. So there are always this conflicting futurities that, if you see them from a point of view of uh, the U.S. or Europe or whatever we call as the West, there is always this risk of attributing a block of temporality to the whole place and just saying, okay, that's it. I need to be careful about it, or it might be endanger my own future, but that's it. Kind of erases a lot of uh, different temporalities that people might be
Yeah.
experiencing there.
Yeah. Like there's definitely a contrast or a tension between um, Sino-futurism with some kind of capital S, capital F for future, that some kind of projection of this whole piece of like this, like 1.6 billion people versus, each individual person has their own like lowercase future that they're just, trying to work towards. Um,
Yeah.
and that's maybe what you get at with ethnography is like the order of magnitude of like tens of people instead of millions and billions of people, um, like what people are actually trying to accomplish with their lives, what are their actual priorities, what do they think the future holds for them.
Yeah. But you can also, I mean, of course, your analytical perch is on this small scale. But
Right.
what you can also always do is to, once you're engaged with these people, then you can talk with them about the bigger narrative,
Mm-hmm.
about a billion point 67 people. And then, that allows you to, you're experiencing a very small scale, but you're talking about the larger scale. So you can kind of at least compare how these people see the larger scale and not just how you see it. Because how you see it is,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not for us, but for many people in Europe and the US, it's likely to be as a threat or
Mm-hmm.
as an immediate
Mm-hmm.
challenge to their own temporality. So
So what are some of the themes that have emerged from I think maybe just digging back into your work on Chinese social media, selfies, memes, like what are people making memes about?
yeah, well, my work started quite randomly because I was doing research on underground music scenes, and this was the late 2000s, and I started to realize that all my research, uh, all the threads of my research were pointing towards digital media because people were actually, uploading music online and chatting online and making friends online, and the scene was like not just in venues but on websites. So that's why I moved into doing more media oriented digital media ethnography. And in the beginning, so I'm talking early 2000s when I started writing my, no, doing research for my PhD, most of what was written about China was concerned with, understandably concerned with politics and
Hmm.
democratization
Censorship.
and censorship. Yeah, that was like the three big things. And there was some very good work done on it. But as entering into the field, I was like, okay, everybody's writing about the Great Firewall, and everybody's writing about one specific meme that is subversive against the state or the Communist Party.
草泥马.
Yeah, exactly. And or they're writing about the potential of Weibo or this website for the democracy in China. And so
Yeah.
I really didn't want to do one more thing of that kind. And instead, I mean, I was lucky because I had a lot of friends in China, and they all used all kinds of digital media, and they dragged me into this different kinds of websites and platforms, and they shared memes with me, and we did stuff together. So I could, I said, okay, now I can write about this as it's happening on a more granular level, not having necessarily to engage with politics or the state. And of course, I did, but because it happens. But I was just I wanted to write something that explained um, how Chinese internet users were creating their own what I call digital folklore, which is a term I just borrowed
Mm.
from Oli Elena. But so basically, how do people use the internet in a place that's clearly very much disconnected from the global internet? How do they create their own languages and their own um, semiotic resources? So yeah, memes, but all kind of things like humor, jokes, ways of making fun of people, parodies, even online phenomena like planking and that kind of stuff. I was just interested in the how these things are produced in everyday life. And so most of my research are just hanging out with friends in China in different cities and seeing how they use the smartphones or their computers to you know browse the internet and check out on their friends and exchange or create memes sometimes. And so like the conclusions of my work are very much like, especially seen from today, they're very uninteresting, I would say. I mean, it's just there is nothing that says, oh, Chinese people do this differently or they do this because of a specific reason. It's more like just like anybody else,
Right.
but in a different context. They use what they can find at hand to create uh, their own languages that might be connected to a specific generation or a specific online communities or a specific kind of interest and fandoms. Um, that's it, really. So, yeah, I don't. I never really have an interesting conclusion to give, but that's why I guess I haven't written a unified, book length discussion of this, but just short articles, which are usually separate topics. And
Sure.
yeah,
Well, I mean, I think that in and of itself is a fairly, like, it's an argument or a story that doesn't really get told that much in Western media because it's maybe on the surface not so interesting, which is just that Chinese people are just, you know, moving through their lives like people are anywhere else, and they're making some memes about it, and they're um, um, telling jokes, but they're going to school, they're going to work, they have careers, they're getting married, they're
yeah. I think the it's always the difference comes from when you look at a specific case, then you can have a more substantial conclusion. So one example could be the article I wrote about selfies with a colleague. So on the surface, yeah, of course, I mean, people in China take selfies like anybody else takes selfies all over the world, right? But what changes is, there are different changes that you can see at a more granular level when you do ethnographic engagement or interviews. Because okay, now you see that people are not just using iPhones, but they have all kind of Chinese brands of phones that might have different cameras or cameras that flip or cameras that have beauty filters embedded in them. So that's already shaping, the kind of selfies they take. And then you look at the apps. So okay, they're not sharing them on Instagram, but they're sharing them through WeChat, which has different privacy controls and different, you know, kind of social connections. So many of the people have their parents or their family on WeChat, so they don't want to, they're not sharing the kind of selfies that you would share on Instagram, but they're applying different filters or masking their surroundings and stuff. So these kind of things, I think are more valuable conclusions, but you can only see them on a very
Sure.
small scale,
Well,
or a very specific.
I mean, not necessarily, because at the same time, you're also seeing some of those same features make their way into Western social media too. With like TikTok and,
Yeah, sure.
Instagram, Snapchat.
Yeah, no, what I
filters.
mean is like it's hard to generalize, because if you generalize, then you end up saying, the usual things like, okay, well, I guess Chinese people don't care about privacy, or
Right,
like, I guess they
right.
care, like if you generalize, it's hard to maintain the validity of the point. But definitely it's important, because then, a year later you see that, I mean, TikTok is now like huge in India and the US, and it's creating all kind of questions for people there. And, a year before, you could just have studied how it was used in China, and you probably could have predicted some of these issues.
So I think we're probably running short on time, but maybe an interesting note to end on would be TikTok. As maybe one point of intersection where the big picture stories of like China and technology is kind of bleeding through, not just into like Chinese everyday life, but into everyday life in other parts of the world. In the US, like TikTok is so popular, but it's like I wonder if it even has, if there are some aspects of not to be like essentialist about it, but like, is there something Chinese about TikTok?
I think there is something Chinese in the sense that it's very much product of its time. I mean, if you look at TikTok on a purely, interface-based level, and what it does and how people use it, it's basically Vine, right? It's like it has to take that niche of an app. I mean, Vine failed and disappeared, and now it's just archived, and there hasn't been an alternative for a long time. I mean, Instagram videos have kind of filled that niche. But TikTok is very much Chinese in the sense that it's probably the first app that is created in China by a massive Chinese startup that manages to become global. Because even WeChat, it's huge in China, and it has made some efforts to reach other markets, but it's never gone global. But TikTok is the first app that actually manages to arrive in the US, and many people don't even know it's actually created by a Chinese company. So I think in that sense, it's very much Chinese, as in it's very much about China in 2019 and the state of its digital media industry, whereas it has become competitive and probably, pioneering, at least in some respects, and kind of sensing and getting the pulse of what is the global state of social media usage. So, they made a product that is, that has success worldwide because it allows people to just, take videos and have fun and just scroll through random stuff around them. And yeah, in that sense, it's very representative. And it's also, it's very much, it's purposefully non-Chinese in its presentation. So when you install TikTok, you would really not have a clue that it's Chinese, because it has adopted a, kind of a name that is not Chinese, and all the, there's nothing visibly Chinese about it. And so I think that's part of its success.
Do you think that Chinese people use TikTok differently from how Westerners use it? Because it fits into a different place in the respective like social media ecosystems. Like, does TikTok mean something different in China from what it does in Europe or the US?
Yeah, definitely different. Well, I mean, first of all, they started using it much earlier, because I mean the Chinese version of Douyin was out years ago,
Right.
and it has also much more competition in China, because it's just one among many of these micro video apps. So I've actually never done research on Douyin in China, so about TikTok, but I've done research about other video apps that were very popular around 2016, 17.
Hmm.
And, people were using them in very specific ways already. Um, in my case, they were used for very like small scale online
Right.
celebrity building, especially in more rural areas, and also to sell stuff, to sell services. So as a kind of a promotional platform.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that Douyin is used in a similar way in China, and I don't know how it's been adopted in other places, but for what I've seen, it kind of filled the niche of that Vine left from the kind of humor, and then it also bought musically, which kind of made it,
Right.
it kind of combined these two kind of user bases. So the more like performative singing
Hmm.
user base with the more video based one. So
Yeah.
that's it.
There's something really interesting about TikTok in the how you can use the audio from a previous video and
Yeah.
and like pair up like um, mime it out, whether it's music or like dubbing over someone else's words. It allows for like this interesting. It's like almost like a new type of like a meme format that it's not visual but it's audio and visual because you're using someone else's audio with a new video.
Yeah, I should look into. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if this was actually incorporated in the app after they acquired
Mm.
Musically, because I'm thinking it might be part of the
Mm.
same architecture. Um, but yeah, I mean the whole popularity of TikTok, it comes from the fact that it enables for these meme formats or for this uh, for different shticks that you can do easily, because it's already prepared. It's like Snapchat filters, but like on a massive level, which to have like backgrounds and camera
Hmm.
motions and ways of cutting between scenes just with a
Hmm.
smartphone. So uh, it's definitely something that is very much aware of meme
Yeah,
culture in 2019, and what people that want to create this kind of content, what they need in technical terms. And so, yeah, it's successful. I mean, it's as many apps, it would just probably just go up and down when the next iteration of a new app comes out. Who knows from
sure.
where? But it just shows how these market uh, shift and flow around
Hmm.
globally.
And I think the micro celebrity thing is also interesting because that's something that I've noticed on both like TikTok as well as like Chinese video platforms is this emergence of micro celebrities who are um, extremely popular within like this like very niche fan base, whether it's because they're good looking or they're funny or they have some kind of shtick that they do. Um, like the dynamics around it are actually like more similar than I would have expected.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know. I don't know. Like the difference that I felt was more pronounced was that at least in Italy, I don't know how it is in the US, but at least in Italy, when you have these kind of platforms, and they have a kind of locational function. So, like if I open TikTok here, I will see Italian TikTok, right?
Hmm.
Um, Whereas in China, I felt like these kind of video apps were much more local
Mm.
based. So people like would look at people around them, if it makes sense. This might be like just a matter of like scale of the country, or um, but even with live streamers and stuff, there was always the kind of a localization of like trying to interact with streamers in your own city or something like that. So there's more like much more like granular idea of locality. Um, so yeah, as I said, the video app I was looking at, I was in like in a countryside, and I would just see countryside related content around me, and even like the channels they were advertising something were actually nearby. So like people who see those advertisements can just go and buy stuff. So I don't know. It just like my perception was that it was much more like less nationwide and more like locally based, which might be the case because people want to use these apps to make some money, quick money, and help their business. And to help their business, they need to stay local rather than go like nationwide. Nobody would care.
Any closing thoughts?
I mean, many thoughts. There was a lot of interesting questions that we managed to
Yeah.
squeeze together, and I hope it makes sense. But we started from field
Yeah.
recordings down to TikTok. It's pretty wild, but yeah, it was good.
Yeah, no, I mean there's so much to cover, and I feel like this could easily have been 6 different conversations.
Yeah, sure.
I'm wondering if I can try to thread together some kind of concluding thought or question, but it's difficult, as you said, because like whenever you start to talk about these things, like the conclusion is always just that stuff is more complicated than we thought.
Yeah, but I think it fits. It's. I mean, it fits the podcast, or at least the idea I got of the podcast by listening to it.
Sure.
Because I mean, this idea of coordinated universal time, but also the whole idea of thinking about the future and in a more open-ended way, um, like in a more speculative, open-ended way, and finding strategies and tactics for making sense of it. I don't have a solution, and I don't want to come across as saying, everybody come do ethnography. I don't think methods are ever the solution. I think it's always about what you do with them.
Mm,
And I think the biggest effort is always threading things back together, just
mm,
like we did in this episode.
mm.
And so I guess the encouragement would be just like go find out stuff and then thread it together in a way that's that has a purpose or that works basically.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Coordinated Universal Time, signing off.
Coordinated Universal Time is a sonic collage of Fox Fireside readings, thinking machines, disembodied conversations, music we found in this world or made in another, deep time reverberations and field recordings from the front lines of a future held in common, an oral zine hand-pasted and neural networked by solar golems from the 23rd century, still quickening in the coals of the present, a podcast for now.
Universal time.